Australians face financial ruin by lies and propaganda. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. Hello, John. Back in the studio again.
We are back now. Martin, people have said, when are we going to start talking about macroeconomics? And we're going to talk about macroeconomics. So we're going to park ASIC over to one side for a bit. But yesterday, Martin, was a profound day. The RBA Governor, before Senate estimates, taking questions for about 90 minutes from a whole host of senators about his performance, the issue of inflation, the issue of interest rates. So, there are people who are being smashed left, right, and center in this economy, and obviously your data, the DFA data set, the authoritative source on stress, says we have record mortgage stress, record rental stress. Yep. People are really struggling out there, and we're going to get into the process of financial ruin is happening for a number of households at the moment. And yet all the RBA governor could do in front of the parliament yesterday is absolutely lie through his teeth. The parliamentarians, unfortunately, and some of the parliamentarians who have actually appeared on this channel were hapless in actually picking apart the lies of the RBA governor. But that's what we're going to do today. Where did this inflation come from? Could it have been foreseen? And the RBA governor has a set narrative which is not supported by the facts. I mean, he said yesterday, we follow the facts, the evidence, and the analysis. Well, we're going to show the real facts today, and we're going to show that in my view, and I won't speak for you, Martin, but in my view, this RBA governor is, if not the most incompetent governor in the history of Australia, he's probably corrupt because, the facts don't line up with what he's saying, and yet he continues to take a $1 million or $900,000 salary and basically say, well, I'm not going anywhere. I don't have to account for my sins. And I'm just thinking to myself, he has, if we're going to be blunt about this, Martin, and I'm really worked up about this, if Philip Lowe was in the private sector and he caused this much financial harm, he'd be under an investigation by ASIC, he'd be facing criminal charges, and he'd likely go to jail for what he has done. And yet, somehow, his so-called independence, we must genuflect at the altar of the RBA. I mean, it's time. Now, to his credit, Senator Kim has called for his resignation. He called it on Twitter after the hearing. In my view, there is no justification for the RBA governor to stay on because he is so inept as an economist. He has done deep harm and embarrassment to my profession.
Yeah, John, I think it's worth saying that the narrative of it's the war that did it or it's COVID that did it, which is actually what central bankers around the world are actually throwing out there to excuse their mismanagement of the economy over the last 20 years, is something that we see again and again and again. We saw it yesterday. It is just not, though, the underlying issue that's created the problems that we're actually now facing. And you and I have been talking about this for some time. This was as expected, isn't it?
That is correct. Now, under the Senate rules, it is a breach of parliamentary standards and obligations for witnesses to provide misleading or false evidence to a Senate committee. And that's what the RBA governor did yesterday. Now, before we get into his lies, let's actually just talk about where we are in terms of the economy. Yep. Because there was a very remarkable article this morning in the Financial Review. And let's put slide 1 on the screen, Martin, is that so we have at least now 120,000 households that are now in negative equity. And obviously, I'm already starting to hear this story, Martin, where some households are in cash flow difficulty. They're struggling to pay the mortgage. They want to go refinance and see if they can get a better interest rate or better terms or a longer loan. And yet, because they are in negative equity, the bank is unwilling to refinance. And in that situation, these households are going to be forced to sell. And when they sell, if they do sell at a loss because they can't service the mortgage, so they started the process of buying a property with some savings that took them a number of years to build a deposit, and they're going to walk out with nothing. And all of this is because they listened to the so-called authority. And it's not just the RBA governor. And again, so, all these so-called respected voices on Twitter who basically said that, who have some sort of credibility, Kukulos, Shane Oliver from AMP, Chris Richardson for Deloitte Access Economics, all of them were pro-stimulus. All of them were basically supporting the key decisions of what the government and the RBA did in 2020. And obviously, I had my big clash with Senator Rennick about his position, the Parliament's position versus what I was warning about. And yet, no accountability in the entire profession. This is why I say these economists are cash for comment. They will say and do anything in order to earn a quid, whether they're right or wrong. And if they're wrong, we made assumptions, we were wrong, circumstances changed, people we had people who didn't understand the caveats. I heard that this week. And then you had Mr. Hogan, Warren Hogan, a former chief economist for one of the big four banks, who said people misread the RBA. No, I perfectly read the RBA. The RBA just completely doesn't understand what the hell they're doing.
No, that's unfortunately true. And I think it's worth just underscoring one thing, John. We have full recourse lending in Australia. So that means that even if when you come to sell, you sell at a loss, right, and you lose the property, you still owe the bank the remains, right? That's different for many states in the US. So a lot of people are going to find that the only way out of this is ultimately bankruptcy. I mean, this is now serious.
Yes. And one question maybe for you, Martin, just so we can give a bit of warning for our audience. So we've got 100, according to the AFR today, we've got 120,000 households in negative equity. Do you have a sense as to how quickly that's going to grow in the next few months as the past interest rate increases flow through into the economy? And then obviously the RBA governor said yesterday that more rate rises are coming forward.
Well, it is tricky because, of course, the question is how far will house prices fall? To what extent will people be able to refinance? I mean, the banks are already extending loans out over 35 years. They're actually negotiating in some cases for interest only rather than principal interest to try and help people. So it is a bit of a question as to how many households are going to get some sort of help from the banks. I expect to see a lot more of that. But if we make the assumption that the sorts of calls which are now being made with 20% falls in property prices, if that comes through and maybe goes worse than that, then that 120,000 will be just a drop in the bucket. We could be looking at 400,000 to 500,000 households who essentially will have no equity in their property, will be locked in. Then it's a question of will they be able to service the mortgages in the interim, or will they be forced to sell? Because of course negative equity doesn't immediately create a critical issue, providing they continue to service the loan. But it does often stop people refinancing to cheaper mortgages. And quite often it's a leading indicator of trouble later. And it's interesting to note that after the global financial crisis in the UK, a decade later, there were still people on negative equity. So these are things that don't just happen at a point in time, they have significant impact into the future.
And the important aspect about being able to service the mortgage is today we see from the Australian Bureau of Statistics that that unemployment is up from 3.5% to 3.7%.
Yep.
And then in terms of the hours worked, that's down 2.1%. So people with fewer jobs, people with fewer hours, that's going to make a certain class of citizen who are either renting or with a mortgage struggling to, in terms of meet their cash flow obligations.
Yeah, and of course, inflation is still high. It's not really coming off here in Australia, and the expectation is they're talking about significantly higher power bills ahead, probably not quite as high as previously expected, but still very much higher. Cost of food still rising. So wherever you look, there's more distress to come, and of course the interest rates, probably another 2 or maybe 3 rises from where we are. That's what the RBA is saying. If that does get propagated through into mortgages, then more people are going to get into difficulty. I mean, this is the fear that we had some time back that they were going to wreck the economy. Well, it's now being wrecked before our very eyes.
Yes. Now, Martin, those households that probably spent, particularly first-time buyers, and obviously, you've spoken a lot about the bank of mum and dad. Those people who have spent a long time building up deposit. They deserve an explanation as to how has it now resulted in many of these people are going to lose the deposit, and they've obviously wasted maybe in some cases 5 years of their working life. How did this come about? Now, the RBA has a stated position as to where did this inflation come from, because obviously their justification is the inflation has come in 2022. It was decades high. The RBA governor said, yes, Australians have forgotten all about inflation, and therefore we need to be aggressive with interest rates to get the inflation under control. And obviously we now see a massive pile-on with the RBA governor to say you're going too hard in terms of interest rates. But where did the inflation come from? So let's go, Martin, to slide 2. This is the from the RBA Statement of Monetary Policy that was released last Friday, and this is the quote, high inflation outcomes in Australia reflect a range of developments, including supply issues related to the war in Ukraine, other global supply disruptions resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, and domestic supply disruptions from poor weather. Strong domestic and global demand has played a role reflecting the rapid economic recovery following the significant fiscal and monetary policy responses to the pandemic and the faster than expected development of effective vaccines. But the reason why, Martin, I have highlighted this supply issues related to the war in the Ukraine, because this was the popular narrative last year, that the war in Ukraine has led to this massive surge in inflation. This was the unanticipated event. Obviously, in 2021, the RBA governor basically said rates won't go up until 2024 because there'll be no inflation. And supposedly, no one could foresee that Putin was going to invade Ukraine, therefore circumstances changed. Now, this is a categorical 100% lie, and that's what we're going to expose in today's show, because for those people who believe this crap that's going on the mainstream media, they're just going to somehow allow the RBA to escape, darken the night. His term ends in September, and look, I don't think he will be reappointed because there's just too much political damage around his governorship, and yet he's probably going to go into a nice cushy job in the private sector, and yet households are going to be left picking up the pieces. So now, just so we can bring our audience back to the record of this channel, which is, and I don't want to be too provocative, is slightly different to the record of DFA. So obviously, just so we're clear, a lot of the content on this channel is a lot of it is my thesis. I mean, sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree. The content on DFA is your content. Sometimes you have guests on who express their own particular view, but there was a series of clear shows that we did in 2020 and 2021, and some of this was based on my own research and writings, and I had a very clear view as to what was going to happen. So if we can just recap, Martin, we'll put slide 3 on the screen. So on the 19th of June 2020, I said house prices are unlikely to collapse in terms of the next 18 months, and that was obviously I could see what the stimulus was going to be. In terms of QE2 Infinity, which they announced in March of 2020, and then obviously in terms of the fiscal response. So by the 3rd of August, if we put on slide 4, we did a show called Stagflation is occurring before your very eyes, weak economy, issues with unemployment and economic growth, and obviously inflation starting to, inflation didn't emerge in the sense of the statistics, but the inflation was starting to emerge in terms of the economy, because you could start to see all of this money being pushed out into the economy in terms of job seeker, job keeper, in terms of low interest rates, etc. So that's why I knew the inflation was coming, because I could see in real time what was coming, look at what was happening. And then if we go on to slide 5, I wrote an article for my old website, and this was and then we did a show on the 12th of February 2021. And the show was called Joe Biden Will Unleash Accelerated Stagflation. And I said the inflationary process of 2020 is going to get faster in 2021, and the inflation genie was already out of the bottle. So the clear thing that the audience needs to understand, Martin, is that well before the war, and let's be clear about this, the invasion of Ukraine commenced on the 24th of February 2022. So before that invasion, I was saying massive inflation, stagflation problem, and obviously people needed to adjust their economic behavior to match in terms of the phenomena. Now, obviously in 2021, 2022, we went offline for 9 months, and we didn't really speak a lot about interest rates. So I didn't have any public comments that interest rates were going to surge in 2022, but let there be no doubt that we were clearly saying we got a big inflation problem well before the war. Now, how did I know this was going to happen? So, Martin, if we can go on to slide 6, what we can see is what did the US Federal Reserve do with the money supply in response to when they announced QE to infinity. So this is a graph going back to the 1960s, and then all of a sudden you see this exponential increase in M1 money supply to the tune of $16 trillion. So that is the graph speaks for itself how extreme the policy response was in March. And the reason why they did this was because, and we covered this at the time, in September of 2019, the repo market blows up, and they were trying to patch up the system. And obviously the COVID gave the central banks the excuse to inject a lot of additional liquidity into the system to ensure the stability of in terms of the banks and the capital markets. And that was what happened in the context of the US. Now, if we move on to slide 7, we can see that even in the case of Australia, the Australian M1 money supply increased sharply from the start of the pandemic by the tune of, in terms of $500 billion. So we went from about 1.2 trillion to $1.7 trillion. So even though that our M1 money supply was not as radical as the US, all of the major central banks printed to the hilt, and all of this. I mean, if you follow the Austrian school, the writings of Ludwig von Mises, you knew that this was going to create inflation, and that's how I knew that we were going to have an inflation problem, which at some point had to be addressed in terms of the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can go back right the way back to the global financial crisis, because liquidity started to build there, and then they accelerated it again. And the money supply and the impact of money supply, the devaluation of the real value of money, all of those things are all sitting here lurking below the surface. But the net result is, you've got more money chasing the same goods and services. No wonder inflation's rising. Exactly.
Now, to prove categorically that Philip Lowe lied to the Australian people yesterday, so we're going to focus on, as we finish off the show, Martin, is 4 commodities where the public position was that the war in Ukraine affected the energy and commodity market. So let's look at slide 8, Martin, and this is the oil price. So this is US dollars per barrel. And so what we can see in this slide was that on the 4th of May 2020, the US price of a barrel of oil was $20.39 per barrel. And then by 28 October 2021, it rose to $81.46. So during the course of 2020 and 2021, the price of oil increased 300%. Now, why did it increase 300%? Because of the money printing. And the money printing seeped into, it went out of the central banks through the commercial banks into financial markets, and it went into commodities. And that's how you see a 300% increase in the price of oil. Now, when the war started in the Ukraine, so the price of oil at that point in time, the day before the war, the day before the invasion, a barrel of oil was $90.69. And then by the 7th of March, oil went up to $115.80. So basically you saw, as a direct short-term response to the invasion, oil increased 28% at that point. And obviously since then, the price of oil has come down. So now, the classical definition of inflation is an increase in the money supply. But the modern definition, which I disagree with, is the change in price, not the change in the volume of money. So if we're using the current modern contemporary understanding of inflation, well, what drove the percentage increase in terms of oil? Well, we could clearly see that the increase pre-war with oil was substantially larger than what happened as a result of the Ukraine invasion. So it's clear to my mind that in respect of oil, the war had only it had an impact. I'm not saying it had no impact, but it had a minor impact compared to what was happening in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, and John, it's worth saying, of course, if you look at today, the oil price is back down again.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So it sort of went up because of the war. That was temporary. It came back down to a level very close to where it was before the war started.
Martin, if we can now direct our attention to slide 9, and we're looking at natural gas, and the unit is metric million British thermal unit. We can see that on the 20th of July 2020, a price and look at a unit of gas was going for $2.28 per unit, and then it rose to $6.31 in the 5th of October 2021. So that's a 177% increase. Now, gas did come down from October through to December, but then when we see, in terms of the day before the invasion, we can see that gas was $4.59, and it rose all the way up to $9.41 by August of 2022, and that's a 105% increase. So we can see that in natural gas, the impact of the war was bigger compared to oil, but again, the increase pre-war was bigger than the impact of the war.
Yep, and once again, if you look at the price today, it's back down. So it went up through the war, and it's come down again.
Exactly, yep. Exactly. Now, if we now go to slide 10, so we'll have a look at coal. Now, and again, so we're talking US dollars per ton. Coal on the 27th of August 2020 was $49.80 per ton, and it rose to $269.50 per ton on the 5th of October 2021, so a 441% increase in the price of coal. And then if you look at what happened in the war, so the 21st of October is a few days before the invasion, coal at that point had come down a bit, so it was at $223.85, and it rose up to $457.80 per ton. So again, a 441% increase during 2020 and 2021, and then as a result of the war, coal only went up 105% in terms of the price of coal. So again, almost a fourfold increase pre-war in the price of coal compared to what was the result as a result of the war.
Yeah, well, again, it's the same old story, isn't it? It went up, came down a little bit. And I suppose one question, John, is whether to what extent all of this is because of supply chain disruptions through the COVID period. Because some people will say, oh, well, you're just picking the war. But of course, the COVID disruption to supply chains was also responsible for these rises in that period.
Well, yeah, but so again, how? I mean, one could say that there was some supply chain disruption in some countries because not every country locked down in the world. So we're talking about a global market. So some countries, like obviously we know about Sweden. I mean, there was no restrictions at all. They just let the virus spread throughout the community. And obviously there were some parts of, say, Africa that had very minor impacts to COVID compared to, say, Europe that had in terms of a heavy impact. So but again, during 2020, I mean, we had a recession. Economic growth was down. So if you want to say that the price increase was a result of reduced supply because of lockdowns, well, on the flip side, there was a compression of demand. So I think that offsets that argument. But again, even if there was a restriction supply, are you going to see a 441% increase in the price of coal over say 18 months? Because that would suggest that there was a major clamp in terms of production, and we know that in the Australian mining sector, even during lockdowns, it was defined as a critical industry, and all forms of mining in this country kept on unabated.
Absolutely, yeah. And the reason I asked that question, John, is because I do get quite a few people who say, "Oh, well, you're ignoring the COVID period supply chain disruption." And of course, both politicians and the RBA blame supply chain disruptions and the war as the reasons why it went wrong. But if you look carefully, I'm of the view, and I think you would follow that too, that no, this was happening before, and the reason is It's the money supply issue. It's all of that quantitative easing, all the other stuff that the central banks did. And remember, John, just to go back, they did that not just in 2020, 21, but they did it through the earlier financial crisis in 2007 to 2009. And I think a lot of the problems that we're now wrestling with were actually created back then.
That I would agree with. And Martin, our last slide, just to show this point, is let's look at wheat. And the reason why wheat's important is because Ukraine is a massive wheat producer in Europe, and so obviously the invasion of the Ukraine had a huge impact on the wheat market. So if we were looking at US dollar per bushel, and again, so these are global prices because commodities are traded on global futures exchanges. So it's important to say, just because we're quoting US prices, I mean, and if some people may say, well, what does a war in Europe have to do with the price of a commodity in terms of US dollars? Well, again, these are global markets with global prices, and so what we can see here is that on the 25th of June 2020, the price in terms of a bushel of wheat was $485.50, and that rose to $856 by the 23rd of November 2021, so a 76% increase. Now, a few days before the war, the price of a bushel of wheat fell down to $790.25, and then it rose up to $1,247 and $1,247.50. So again, the pre-war increase in wheat was 76%, and the impact on wheat because of the war was 58%. And again, wheat has come back down. So again, in these four critical commodities, because again, the issue was that there was an issue with food and energy markets, and that seeped into production, that seeped into supply chains, then that seeped into the CPI. That is the common narrative, and obviously the important aspect that they keep on pushing is it's the war. The war created the unanticipated inflation that now has resulted in 9 interest rate increases. And Martin, look, one thing just to prepare for the show, I looked up the annualized inflation for December 2021, which is 2 months, about 6 weeks before the war. So in Australia, we were at 3.5%, so above the 2 to 3% target range. In the United States, it was 7%. In Europe, it was 5% at the European Union, and the UK, it was 4.8%. And obviously in the US and Europe and the UK, the target is 2%. So without the war, inflation was out of control, in some cases double, triple the target. Yep. We were above our target, and so without the war, the RBA would have been forced to raise rates in 2022 and break this 2024 promise. So now, would it have been to the extent with the war? Probably not. So there would have been a number of rate rises last year, but perhaps not as much as what we have seen. So I'm not saying that the war has had no impact, but for someone to say that without the war there would have been no inflation and there would have been no interest rate increases and the RBA's 2024 promise would have remained intact, that is an absolute lie. And unfortunately, those people who don't watch this channel or follow your work or follow my work have made a series of financial decisions which have now blown up in their face. And as we get into the course of 2023, we are going to see many, many households lose their shirts. And this is all because you have the most incompetent, corrupt governor of the RBA, and he should be on criminal charges. He should be put in jail. And I'm so frustrated that you have so-called respected officials coming before Parliament and pushing complete BS and getting away with it.
No, it's just very concerning, isn't it? Because it's clear that the Senate tries to ask questions, but they don't really have enough knowledge and to arm themselves with what they should be asking. So in a way, they have quite an easy ride when it comes to the RBA, because the RBA can sort of meander around it. But this is a critical issue, because basically what it says is, RBA, you actually helped to create this problem, this inflation problem, right? You created the fire in the first place. And now you're responsible for trying to actually put the fire out. And the only lever you've got is to lift interest rates higher. And by the way, John, it's worth just reflecting that some people will say, as interest rates rise, that is itself inflationary.
Well, the thing is, yes. So Senator Rennick tried to push that argument both in my debate with him, but also yesterday in front of the Senate, and that I don't think that. I mean, that may have some short-term impact, but obviously the purpose of raising interest rates is to reduce aggregate demand.
It's to strangle demand, isn't it? It's to strangle households. It's a deliberate strategy.
Yes, yeah, but obviously, if inflation is created by too much money in the economy, well, you've got to take the money out, and so how do you do that? You raise the cost of the credit.
Yep, absolutely.
So while some people think that economics is some sort of academic obscure science, and you know, my oldest daughter sometimes tells me, you know, that in terms of economics. When you get down to what is real life situation with contracts and in terms of legal processes and people's financial life savings on the line, and in a lot of cases they put their life savings in these deposits. You know, when you screw this up, you screw a lot of households up, and that's why there is so much political pressure on Philip Lowe, because the politicians are hearing it from all across the country.
Absolutely, John. This is a really important conversation, and you know, we want to hold people to account. The RBA Governor, not least amongst them. We'll keep pushing.
100%.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. We'll see you next time.